I keep a ledger, always have. My father kept one, and his father before him, and somewhere back in the line there was probably some Scotch-Irish ancestor scratching tallies into river mud with a stick. It's a habit I can't shake, not a virtue, just a compulsion. When something happens that I can't explain, I open the book and I write the date and I write what I saw. I figure if I can get it into the columns, if I can give it a number or a weight or a measurement, then maybe it won't sit so heavy behind my sternum at 3 in the morning. This story doesn't have a clean column. I've tried. I've got the ledger right here, a battered thing with a cracked spine and water damage along the bottom quarter of every page from the flood of '89. 13 pages concern what happened at the Red Hawk Callaway plot between the spring of '87 and the October of '88. 13 pages, and I still haven't figured out what to put in the final sum line. I'll just tell it straight and let you do the arithmetic. The merchant's name was Aldous Preet, and he came through our stretch of eastern Oklahoma territory every spring with a wagon so overstacked it swayed on the flat road like a drunk finding his way home. He sold lamp oil, seed packets of dubious origin, tin cookware, and in the springtime especially, livestock. Piglets mostly, sometimes a goat. That year, 1887, he had chicks. 342 of them, in flat-slat crates stacked 4 high, cheeping like a single continuous complaint against the universe. I was mending a section of my east fence when Preet's wagon passed my property line, and I watched him slow near the road junction where the Red Hawk land met the old Callaway claim. I watched because that junction had been a source of local gossip and low-grade outrage for going on 8 months. Most of the men in town watched it, one way or another. Mara Red Hawk was Hickory Apache, widowed 2 years prior when her husband Tobias, a man who'd managed to exist at the exact uncomfortable midpoint between 2 worlds without fully belonging to either, died of a lung infection the winter of '85. She'd stayed on the land. That was the first thing people couldn't forgive. She had no sons old enough to claim it, no Anglo surname to anchor her legally, and the county land office had a clerk named Fenwick Broom who considered her continued presence on that property a personal insult to the territorial order. And yet she stayed. She was 34. She had 2 daughters, ages 6 and 9. She had a small kitchen garden, a milk cow of advancing years, and a stubbornness that seemed, to me, less like defiance and more like physics, like an object that simply refused to be moved, because moving would require more energy than the universe had available to spend on her. The Callaway half of the equation was Dermot Callaway, who had inherited 40 acres from a father he disliked, and a debt load from a bank he despised. Dermot was 41, raw-boned, weathered to a kind of permanent amber, with the hands of a man who'd done real work, but the eyes of a man perpetually doing arithmetic and coming up short. His own cattle venture had failed the previous year, a combination of bad weather, bad timing, and a bad decision to trust a cattle broker out of Tulsa whose accent was friendlier than his contracts. Dermot had sold 15 of his 40 acres just to keep the bank from taking all 40. He had 25 acres left, a mule he'd named Grievance, and approximately $17 in actual currency. Nobody in town knew exactly when Mara and Dermot had begun talking, or whose idea the partnership was. The gossip was thick and mostly mean-spirited in the way that small community gossip tends to be, equal parts genuine moral concern and boredom. What people agreed on was this. Sometime in late February of '87, Mara Red Hawk and Dermot Callaway had shaken hands at that road junction, and whatever they'd decided between them, they'd decided it without asking anyone's opinion. When Aldous Preet stopped his wagon at that junction on a Tuesday morning in late March, I was close enough to hear the conversation. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't eavesdropping with any particular intention. I genuinely needed to mend that fence, but I was close, and I heard. Mara came out first. She wiped her hands on the cloth at her hip and looked at the crates of chicks with the focused attention of someone doing calculations. Dermot came around from behind his barn a minute later, still pulling on his coat. Preet did what Preet always did, launched into his pitch before anyone invited it, voice wide and warm as a summer pond. 342 healthy pullets, he said, sweeping his hand along the crates like a man revealing a painting. Barred rocks, mostly couple dozen Rhode Island Reds mixed in. By fall you'll have eggs enough to keep 2 households and sell the surplus, prime stock. Dermot looked at the chicks. How much? For the lot, $11 even. That's less than 4 cents a bird, Callaway. I'm practically giving them away. I saw Dermot and Mara exchange a look. It was a specific kind of look, the kind that happens between people who have already had the hard conversation in private and are now just confirming that neither of them has changed their mind. Mara gave a small nod. Dermot said, "We'll take them." Preet blinked. "The lot." "The lot?" Preet looked from Dermot to Mara and back again. I saw something cross his face, not quite amusement, not quite pity, some uncomfortable blend of both. "Son, 342 chicks need feed, need shelter, need managing. You're talking about a full-time operation. 2 people trying to run that on top of everything else." "We'll take them," Dermot said again, not rude, not loud, just certain. Money changed hands. Preet transferred the crates with the help of his young driver and some considerable physical effort. Before he climbed back onto the wagon seat, he said, "And I wrote this down in my ledger that same evening because it struck me as the kind of thing worth recording. Lord willing, you 2 know what you're doing." He paused. "Because nobody else does." He laughed, his driver laughed. He clicked his horses forward and was gone. By that evening, the story had traveled to the Whitmore store, where the men who gathered there in the late afternoon had opinions the way the creek had water, not always useful, but always present. I know because I was there, getting lamp oil, and I heard Fenwick Broom, the land office clerk, holding court near the dry goods shelf. 300 birds, he said, with the tone of a man describing someone else's theological error. On that plot, with no proper infrastructure, no hired hands, an Apache woman, and a man who couldn't keep 20 cattle alive through one winter. Someone said they gave it 3 months before the whole thing collapsed. Someone else said, too. A man named Hector Peel, who farmed corn poorly and opined on other people's farming excessively, said he'd give it 6 weeks and he'd bet a bottle of rye on it. I didn't say anything. I bought my lamp oil. I wrote in my ledger that night, March 29, 1887. Mara Redhawk and Dermot Calloway purchased 342 chicks from Preet. $11 total. Peel gives 6 weeks. I have no estimate. I am watching. What I did not understand, and what I began to understand over the weeks that followed, was that Mara had a plan. Not a vague optimism. An actual, considered plan. I learned this in pieces, the way you learn most things that matter, sideways, through small observations that don't make sense individually, and then suddenly cohere. The first piece, within 4 days of the purchase, the chicks were housed in a structure that shouldn't have existed. It was a long, low-slung poultry house made from salvaged lumber, old fence rails, and what appeared to be sections of a wagon bed that had seen better decades. It was rough. It was not beautiful, but it was solid, ventilated correctly, and large enough to manage 300 birds without crowding them into disease. I asked Dermot later where it came from. He told me Mara had designed it. She'd sketched it on paper, a system her father had apparently used to overwinter sheep in a different climate, adapted for poultry. She'd done it in an evening. The second piece, Mara's daughters were not bystanders. The older one, Saya, 9 years old, with her mother's stillness and her father's practical squint, had a daily rotation for the waterers and feeders that she ran with the precision of someone twice her age. The younger girl, Lynn, was 6 and mostly responsible for identifying problems and reporting them, which she did with a conscientiousness that I found, frankly, humbling when I compared it to my own habits of observation. The third piece, Dermot was doing something I hadn't expected. He was learning. He'd been a cattle man. He knew nothing about poultry. And instead of pretending otherwise or retreating into the pride that ruins most men who find themselves in unfamiliar territory, he was asking Mara questions. Every day, from what I could see, standing next to her in that poultry house with his arms crossed and his brow furrowed, listening. He had a small notebook, not a ledger like mine, just a cheap composition book, and he wrote things down in it. I never saw what he wrote, but he wrote. April came in warm and then cold and then warm again the way April does, as if it can't make up its mind and resents you for noticing. The chicks feathered out. They were past the most vulnerable stage by the 3rd week, which is when most of the early losses hit a flock. Mara lost 11 birds total in the first month, which Preet himself, had he known, would have considered remarkably good. 6 to a nighttime chill that got under the wall before Dermot patched it. 3 to what Mara diagnosed as a respiratory issue that she contained before it spread, using a separation method and a treatment I didn't recognize and didn't ask about because it was her business, not mine. 2 to what I can only describe as bad luck, which is the honest name for the 10% of farming that no amount of planning prevents. 331 birds then, alive, growing, eating a spectacular quantity of feed. This was where the plan showed its second layer, the one I hadn't seen coming. On a Friday in early April, Myra walked into town. This was not unusual. She came for supplies. What was unusual was that she walked into the Whitmore store and had a conversation with old Ben Whitmore that resulted in a handwritten agreement being signed by both parties and witnessed by his wife Clara, who told me about it 2 days later with the air of someone who'd witnessed something she was still processing. The agreement: Myra would supply Whitmore's store with fresh eggs, guaranteed supply, consistent volume, delivered twice weekly, starting the moment her flock hit laying age, which she projected at 5 months. In exchange, Whitmore would reduce her feed credit by 20% and provide her with a standing account rather than demanding payment in advance. She walked in there with numbers, Clara Whitmore told me. She had a piece of paper. She knew exactly how many birds she expected to be laying by what date, what volume of eggs they'd produce per week, what she needed in feed, and what she could realistically deliver. Ben said it was the most organized proposal anyone had brought into that store in 20 years of business. Clara paused. He also said he nearly fell off his stool. I went home that evening and sat with my ledger open for a long time before I wrote anything. Then I wrote April 11, 1887. Supply agreement signed Redhawk Callaway / Whitmore's. She had numbers. She had always had numbers. We just weren't watching the right things. Dermot's part of the plan, which I understood even later was the market side. He'd grown up trading cattle, which means he'd grown up in conversations with buyers, brokers, and the various middlemen who exist in the space between a producer and a profit. He knew how to talk to merchants. He knew which questions to ask, which numbers mattered, and when to stop talking and let the silence work. In May, he drove to the county seat. He came back 3 days later, dustier and quieter than he'd left, and when I asked him how it went, we'd become the kind of neighbors who talked over the fence by then, which I noted in the ledger without embarrassment, he said. Made some contacts. I said good contacts or complicated ones. He thought about it, both. Which means good. What he'd done, I found out gradually over the following weeks, was establish conversations with 2 hotel dining rooms in the county seat and 1 restaurant that had recently opened and was struggling to source ingredients reliably. He hadn't promised them anything yet. He was just having conversations. He was planting something that would take time to grow, the same way the flock was growing, the same way everything on that plot seemed to operate, slowly, deliberately, according to a calendar only Myra and Dermot could read. June came, the birds hit laying age, some of them, the earliest developers, by the last week of May. By the second week of June, the Redhawk Callaway plot was producing eggs. I want to be precise about this, because I was precise in my ledger, and precision is the only kindness I can offer the memory. Not a trickle of eggs, not a modest output, not a promising start. 322 laying hens producing at a rate that, once they fully hit their stride by midsummer, was generating between 200 and 240 eggs per day. Per day. That is a real number. I confirmed it. I asked Dermot twice because I didn't trust my own calculation. He confirmed it. Myra confirmed it without blinking because she had known it was coming. She had built the whole enterprise on the assumption that it was coming, on the premise that if you manage a flock correctly and plan for it, this is simply what happens. Whitmore's store took twice what Myra had initially promised. He sent a note asking if she could supply more. She sent a note back with a revised schedule and a new price per dozen, which was 3 cents higher than the original agreement. He accepted without negotiation. By July, Dermot had his first restaurant contract. By the end of July, he had his second. I am going to tell you what I saw one evening in late July, because it belongs in the record, and because it is the image that sits clearest when I think of that whole year. I was walking my east fence line at dusk. Another repair, there was always another repair, and I could see the Redhawk Callaway property in the blue-gray light of the late hour. The poultry house was a dark shape against the darker tree line. The kitchen garden was a neat rectangle. The mule, Grievance, was a patient silhouette in the paddock. And on the porch of the small house, the house that had been Tobias Redhawk's house, then Mara's house, and was now in some complicated and entirely uncategorizable way also Dermot Calloway's house, in the sense that he was there most days and some evenings. Two people were sitting. Not close, not touching, just sitting. Myra on the porch rail, straight-backed. Dermot in a chair, elbows on knees, looking at nothing in particular. I could hear, faintly, the sound of the hens settling for the night. That particular low collective murmur that poultry makes in the last hour of daylight, like a room full of people coming to the end of a long conversation. I closed my ledger, went home. Some things don't need a column. August is when things fall apart in Oklahoma. Not dramatically, not with the big theatrical gestures of a spring tornado, just a slow, grinding attrition. The heat comes in like a debt collector who's lost patience, steady and humorless, pressing on everything. The grass goes the color of old paper, the creek drops to a whisper, and livestock, especially poultry, starts showing the strain. I've seen good operations fold in August. I've seen men who knew exactly what they were doing lose half their flock to heat stress in a single week, because heat stress in chickens moves faster than most people expect and is far less forgiving than most people prepare for. You don't get much warning. One day the production numbers are fine. 3 days later you're counting losses. I was at my fence again. I had by that point accepted that mending fence was simply what I did while watching other people's lives proceed. When I saw Dermot come out of the poultry house at a pace that wasn't quite running but wasn't not running either. He went to the well, drew water, went back inside. Came out again, drew more water. His face, even at the distance I was watching from, had the specific look of a man recalculating something at speed. I closed up my tools and walked over. I don't entirely know why. Partly curiosity, partly whatever it is that makes a person move toward trouble rather than away from it, which is a quality I've never been fully sure is a virtue. The inside of the poultry house was 15 degrees hotter than the outside air, and the outside air was already punishing. The hens were panting. Not all of them, not uniformly, but enough of them spread across the far end of the house that it was visible at a glance. Myra was moving between the rows, checking birds, checking waterers, her movements economical and quick in the way they always were. But underneath that, I noticed this only because I'd been watching her for 4 months. There was a tension in her jaw that wasn't normally there. "How bad?" I said, to neither of them in particular. Myra said without looking up, 20 or 30 birds showing heat stress. I've isolated the worst cases. The waterers are low. Dermot said, "We need shade on the south wall. The afternoon sun is hitting it direct, and the wall's been absorbing heat all day and radiating it back in." I looked at the south wall. He was right. It was a design limitation that hadn't mattered in spring and now mattered enormously. "What do you need?" I said. Dermot looked at me for a moment. I think he was deciding whether I was asking or offering. I was offering, and eventually he seemed to understand that. "Canvas, heavy canvas or even burlap in a pinch, enough to shade a 12-foot section." "I've got canvas," I said. "From a wagon cover I never put back on a wagon. Give me 20 minutes. We got the shade up. It took closer to 40 minutes, not 20. These things always do. And we soaked it down with water from the well to give it an evaporative cooling effect that Myra suggested while I was still arguing with the rope tension. She was right. The temperature on the south side of the house dropped enough to matter within an hour. They lost 9 birds that week. Not 20 or 30, 9. Which, given what August could do to a flock that size, was a number that belonged in the miracle column of the ledger if you were the kind of person who kept a miracle column, which I'm not, but which I considered starting. Afterward, when the crisis had passed the acute stage and settled into the dull vigilance of ongoing management, I found myself sitting on an overturned crate outside the poultry house while Myra stood in the doorway looking at her birds. The late afternoon light was the amber gold that Oklahoma does in August when it's trying to apologize for being difficult. Saya was somewhere inside doing her evening rounds. Lynn was asleep on a blanket in the shade of the house, one arm thrown over her face. "You never asked for help before," I said to Myra. Not an accusation, just something I'd noticed. "I didn't need it before," she said. "And now?" She was quiet for a moment. There's a difference between not needing help and not accepting it. "I've been managing that line badly." I didn't say anything to that. It was true, and she knew it was true, and adding words to it would have made it smaller. She looked at me sideways. "You've been watching since March." "I have a fence to mend." "MMH?" The sound was somewhere between a laugh and a comment on my credibility. "I've been watching," I admitted. "And what do you write in that book of yours?" I thought about that, mostly what I see, sometimes what I don't understand yet. She turned to look at me then, fully, with that direct attention that she gave to everything, problems, birds, people, as if looking at something carefully was not rudeness but respect. "Does it help, writing it down?" "Sometimes. It helps me remember that I was wrong before and I'll probably be wrong again." I paused. "It's a humility system." She looked back at her birds. "I should get one of those." The other thing that happened in August, quieter and harder to write about. Fenwick Broom came to the property. He came on a Tuesday, official and alone, with a leather satchel and the particular bearing of a man who is about to do something he believes is correct and has rehearsed his justifications for. He had papers. He always had papers. The land office had papers the way a river has water, continuously, self-replenishing, serving its own momentum. I only know what happened because Dermot told me afterward, and he was not a man who talked easily about things that had unsettled him. So the telling was slow and had gaps in it that I did not try to fill. Broom had come with what he called a title clarification inquiry, which was the land office's way of saying that Mara's continued presence on and productive use of the property had attracted attention, and that attention had generated a question about whether the original deed, transferred to her upon Tobias's death, was in proper order. It was not, Broom implied heavily, a foregone conclusion that it was. Dermot told me he stood there and listened to all of this without interrupting, which must have cost him something, because Dermot was not a man who found interruption difficult under normal circumstances. What Mara said, and Dermot quoted this exactly because he'd apparently written it in his little composition book, was, "The deed is filed with the territorial office in Guthrie, not the county office. The territorial office under the name Mara Redhawk, registered on the 14th of February, 1886. I have a copy." She went inside and brought out the copy. It was, apparently, in better condition than Broom's inquiry paperwork. Broom left. He didn't say much on his way out. Dermot said the man's jaw moved like he was chewing something he decided he didn't want but couldn't spit out in front of company. How did she know to file with the territorial office? I asked Dermot. He looked at me. She said Tobias told her before he died that the county clerk would find a reason to lose a deed filed under her name, but the territorial office had a different clerk and a different disposition. She filed it the same week they buried him. I sat with that for a while, the grief of it, the foresight of it, the fact that she'd been planning for Broom before Broom had even identified her as a problem, that her husband, dying, had thought clearly enough through his own fever and pain to give her that one small structural protection. I wrote it in the ledger that night and underlined it twice, which is the only emphasis system I use, because I think if you underline everything, nothing gets emphasized. September came in like an apology from August, cooler by 15 degrees almost overnight, the light changing from hard amber to something softer and more forgiving. The hens responded the way hens respond to relief from stress. They produced more. The numbers in my ledger climbed. Whitmore sent another note asking about supply. Both restaurant contracts renewed, and Dermot negotiated a price increase on one of them that he described to me with a satisfaction he tried hard to contain and didn't entirely succeed. The money question, which had been theoretical through spring, practical through summer, and was now becoming real, is the part that I think most people expect to be simple. They hear made them rich, and they picture a single transaction, a moment, a dramatic windfall. That is not what happened. What happened was a series of small accumulations, each of which seemed modest and together became something else. The feed credit at Whitmore's turned from debt to credit, meaning they had spent down what they owed and were now, for the first time, owed something in return. That happened in early September. Dermot noted it in his composition book with a single line that he read to me later because I think he wanted a witness. Today we are owed rather than owing. Small difference, not small. By the end of September, they had repaid what remained of the loan that Dermot had taken against his land the previous year. Not all of it, the land itself remained encumbered, but the interest payments were current, and the principal was reduced enough that the bank's letters, which had previously arrived with a frequency suggesting urgency, slowed to one per month, and then to one whose tone had changed from demanding to merely informative. Mara hired a girl from town to help with the midday rounds, a 14-year-old named Priscilla Watt, who had 7 younger siblings and a family that needed her small income, and who learned poultry management so quickly that Mara, by October, was leaving her in charge during the afternoon hours without oversight. Mara used those hours differently. I noticed she was in the kitchen garden more, expanding it, or sitting at the table inside the house with papers and a pencil, working on something. I asked her what once, when I happened to be there for a purpose I've now forgotten. She said, second-year plan. I said, already. She looked at me with genuine puzzlement. When else? There's a moment in most stories, the version people tell afterward, I mean the cleaned-up version, where the hard part ends and the good part begins. A clean transition. A door that closes on the difficulty and opens into something better. I've never found it that simple in practice, and the Red Hawk Calloway story didn't have it either. The hard part didn't end. It changed. It became a different shape of hard. Dermot, somewhere in September, started disappearing into a mood that I recognized but couldn't name until I saw it clearly enough. He was wrestling with something about his position. Not the financial position, that was improving, steadily, measurably, in ways he could track in his book and I could track in mine. Something else. Something about what he was and what he'd become on that property. About whether the thing he was building with Mara was genuinely equal or whether it was, underneath, still a version of the old arrangement. The white man who holds the legal standing, the native woman who does the knowing, and the gap between those two things dressed up in the language of partnership. I know this because he told me. Not all at once, it came out in pieces over several conversations, the way something heavy comes out when a person is too tired to keep carrying it and too proud to just set it down cleanly. We were fixing my fence again, the east section, because that fence was apparently going to need mending until one or both of us died, and he said, without preamble, "She knows every single thing that's made this work. Every decision that mattered was hers." And I walk into town, and I deal with Whitmore and the restaurants and the bank, and every one of those men looks at me like I'm the proprietor. I didn't say anything immediately. There wasn't a fast answer to that. "And she knows it," he said. "She doesn't say it, but she knows it." "What does she say when you bring it up?" He was quiet for a long moment. "She says the structure that irritates me is also the structure that keeps Broom from coming back with better paperwork. That the fact that my name carries weight with the bank is not my doing and not my virtue, but it's real, and it's in service of something she built, and she'd rather have a flawed tool that works than a principled objection that costs her the property." I thought about that for a while. That's a very clear-eyed thing to say. "She's a very clear-eyed person." He said it without resentment, with something more like awe. "I keep trying to be bothered on her behalf, and she keeps refusing to let me." "Maybe she doesn't need you to be bothered on her behalf." He looked at me. "No, maybe what she needs is for me to keep showing up and doing the part she can't, and to do it without making it about my conscience." I wrote that down. Not that evening, I didn't want to write it while I was still inside it. A week later, when I could see it from a little more distance, Calloway, October 3rd. He is learning something harder than poultry management. He is learning that being useful is not the same as being the hero of something. Most men never learn it at all. The end of part 2 should have a clean line, a moment of arrival. I don't have one. What I have is October 14th, a Wednesday, which was the day I walked past the road junction and saw a new sign posted at the edge of the Red Hawk Calloway property. It was a simple wooden board, painted white with black letters, Saya's handwriting, I found out later, which she'd been practicing for weeks. It said, "Red Hawk and Calloway, fresh eggs, inquire within." Both names Red Hawk first. I stood at that junction for longer than I should have, looking at that sign, trying to figure out what I was feeling and why it was affecting me as much as it was. It wasn't surprise. Nothing about those two had surprised me for months. It was something else. Something closer to the feeling of recognizing a word in a language you've been learning slowly, without quite realizing you were learning it, and suddenly being able to read it. I walked home, opened the ledger. Dermot, who happened to be outside and witnessed this, told me about it that evening. He told it without gloating, which I respected, though I could see the effort involved. He said Mara had come out, listened to Peel's indirect circumlocution, and then said simply and clearly her price per dozen, her payment terms, and the delivery schedule. Peel had agreed to all three without negotiating on a single point. "She didn't say anything after he left," Dermot told me. "She just went back inside." "What would you have said?" He thought about it. Probably something I'd regret. He paused. She has much better judgment about which moments deserve words and which ones don't. November brought the second crisis. I say second because August was the first, and I've since learned to expect that operations which succeed over time do not succeed because they avoid crises. They succeed because the crises they face are different each time, and the people inside them find different ways to survive each new version. This one started with weather. A November ice storm, unusual for the territory, not unheard of, came through with 3 days of warning that were not enough warning. The poultry house held, but the water supply froze at the well, and keeping several hundred birds watered in sub-freezing temperatures is the kind of problem that sounds like a logistics challenge and reveals itself, once you're inside it, to be a physical endurance test. I showed up at the property at 6 in the morning of the second day because I'd spent the night thinking about the waterer situation and couldn't sleep for it. Mara was already up. She was already outside with a lantern and 2 buckets, moving water from the snowmelt she'd been collecting in the kitchen. She'd put out every vessel she owned before the freeze set fully in, which was the kind of foresight I should have predicted from her and didn't. Dermot was inside the poultry house running a low fire in the small stove she'd installed there specifically for deep winter use, which I'd forgotten was there, and which now seemed like the most important object in the world. Saya was up. She was 9 years old and it was 6 in the morning in November, and she was carrying a bucket between 2 hands with the serious face of someone who has decided to be helpful and is going to be helpful regardless of the temperature. Lynn was indoors. Mara had apparently drawn the line somewhere, and Lynn was managing it from inside by keeping the stove in the main house going so that there was warmth to come back to. We worked for 3 hours, all of us. By the time the light came up properly and the birds were watered and the most critical tasks were done, we were all 4 of us, Myra, Dermot, Saya, and me, sitting on the floor of the poultry house with our backs against the warm stove wall, too tired to speak at the same time we were too wired to stop moving. The hens were calm. The straw smelled of earth and warmth. Outside, the ice was terrible and white and very still. "We'll lose some birds to this," Mara said eventually, not distressed, informational. "How many?" Dermot said. "Depends how long it holds. Maybe 10. Maybe fewer if we keep the stove right." Dermot nodded. He was looking at the hens the way I'd seen him look at them for months now. No longer like a man calculating assets, but like a man who has stopped calculating and started caring, which is a different thing entirely and not always more comfortable. Saya, who had been very quiet, said, "I counted 319 this morning." Myra looked at her. "When?" "Before you came out, when I got up. I wanted to know." Myra put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and didn't say anything. I wrote it down later, not in the numbers column, but in the margin, where I put things that don't fit in the columns. The 9-year-old counted the birds before dawn because she wanted to know. She is her mother's daughter in every meaning of that. The ice held for 4 days and they lost 7 birds, not 10. Mara revised her projection upward in the second-year plan without visible emotion, which was not the same as not feeling it. I'd been watching her long enough to know what her face did when something cost her, and she decided not to show it, and it did that thing briefly when she updated the number. Then she kept working. By the time December arrived, they had 312 laying hens. The supply agreements were holding. The restaurant contracts had expanded. A 3rd establishment had come inquiring in November, and Dermot had negotiated terms that, when he outlined them to me one evening, made me sit back and reconsider everything I'd assumed about him when I'd first met him as the man who'd failed at cattle. He hadn't failed because he was incapable. He'd failed because he'd been in the wrong arrangement, working with the wrong margins, and learning the wrong lessons. He was a capable man in an incapable situation, which looks like incompetence from the outside, and only reveals itself otherwise when the situation changes. The land debt was resolved in December. I was not there when it happened, but Dermot told me about it afterward, with the understated flatness that people use when they're describing something they still can't fully believe they've experienced. He'd gone to the bank. He'd made the final payment. The banker, a man named Corvin who had previously corresponded with Dermot in the tone of a man communicating with someone he considers a lost cause, had apparently offered his hand and a comment about the operation's impressive turnaround. Dermot said he'd shaken the hand because refusing it would have cost energy he didn't have. But he'd thought of Mara the entire time, and the thought had served as a kind of ballast. Did you tell him it wasn't a turnaround? I said. That you were starting from different circumstances, then he understood. No, Dermot said, then. I said the enterprise was built on better foundations than he'd been led to believe. He paused. He thought I meant the poultry house. This is what I want to say about the word rich, since I used it in my ledger and I've been living with it since. It is a smaller word than what happened to them. By the end of the first full year, the Red Hawk Callaway operation was profitable. Genuinely, sustainably, not dependent on luck profitable. The kind of profitable that comes from margins and contracts and managed costs rather than good weather or good fortune. They had plans to expand in spring. They had 2 employees, counting Priscilla Watt. They had paid down the debt and were beginning to accumulate the first money either of them had possessed in years that was not immediately owed to someone else. But that is the financial record, which is what rich means if you mean it narrowly. What I mean when I write it in my ledger, and I've written it there in the final summary line of the 13 pages, after years of trying to find the right word, is something harder to measure. I mean that Mara Redhawk, who had been widowed and overlooked and legally threatened and laughed at by a traveling merchant, and given 2 months by a man betting rye whiskey on her failure, had built something that would outlast all of those people's opinions of her. I mean that Dermot Callaway, who had arrived at that property as a man with fewer assets than failures, had learned, slowly, imperfectly, in the margins of his own composition book, how to be genuinely useful to something larger than himself. I mean that Saya, who was 9, knew how to count birds before dawn. I mean that Lynn, who was 6, knew how to keep a fire going when the work was outside and the warmth was needed inside. Rich is the wrong word, but I don't have a better one in the ledger format, so it'll have to do. In late January of 1888, Aldous Preet came through again. I was not at my fence, it was January, and I have limits. But I heard about it from Clara Whitmore, who heard it from her husband, who'd seen Preet's wagon from the store window. He'd pulled up at the road junction. He'd seen the sign. He'd sat on his wagon seat for what Ben Whitmore described as a long time considering. Then he'd driven on. He didn't stop. He didn't knock. He didn't make another joke about whether they knew what they were doing. I opened the ledger that evening and turned to the final line of the 13 pages. I'd been leaving it blank. I'd been waiting for the right thing to write there, the right number or observation that would close the record with appropriate weight. I wrote Preet saw the sign and drove on, no comment recorded. Then, after a moment, below it, in the small handwriting I use when I'm not sure if something belongs in the ledger, but I'm putting it there anyway. Some things don't need a final column. They just need someone who was watching when they happened. I have one more thing to report, which I did not write in the ledger because I didn't learn of it until much later, and by the time I learned of it, the ledger had moved on to other accounts and other years. Mara's second-year plan, the one she'd been working on that autumn, precise and organized and ambitious in the measured way, included, in its final section, a line item I found out about because Priscilla Watt told me years afterward when she was grown and running her own household, and had reason to look back on that time with the clarity that distance provides. The line item was for Priscilla's wages, starting from the day she was hired, set at a rate that was Priscilla checked. She'd kept her own records because Mara had encouraged her to 3 cents per hour higher than what other households in the territory paid for comparable work. Not because Mara had extra money to spend, because she'd planned the operation to be able to afford it from the beginning. She had built the margin for fair wages into the second-year plan before she had the second year's income to support it. Priscilla said she didn't know this for several years. She said when she found out she sat with it for a long time. She said she still sits with it sometimes. I wrote it finally in a margin of the ledger, years after the pages were full. Not in the columns, there's no column for it. Just in the margin, in the handwriting I use for things that don't fit. She had planned for it from the beginning. Some people know, before they even start, the kind of thing they're trying to build.